Sometimes the smallest hands hold the biggest secrets, and sometimes those secrets are the only thing standing between a child and the dark. Emma Grace. Thompson sat perfectly still at table 12 in the Desert Rose truck stop, her 6-year-old fingers methodically tearing paper napkins into precise strips. Not the random destruction of a bored child, something deliberate, something desperate. Her blonde pigtails hung motionless as her bright blue eyes swept the diner, searching for someone, anyone who might understand. Across from her, David Sullivan turned another page of his newspaper, never once looking at the little girl he claimed was his niece. No smile, no conversation, no affection. Emma's small hands continued their work, arranging the torn napkin pieces with careful intention. H-E-L-P. The letters lay scattered across the red Formica table like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale, a trail that might lead her home if only someone would notice before it was too late. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The late afternoon Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Interstate 40, turning the asphalt into shimmering waves of heat. Desert Rose truck stop sat like a forgotten oasis amid the endless stretch of sagebrush and red rock, its neon sign flickering weakly against the copper sky. This was the kind of place where people passed through but rarely lingered, unless they had something to hide. Mike Harrison pulled his battered Ford pickup into the gravel lot, steam rising from under the hood like smoke signals of distress. At 37, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd spent too many years following orders and not enough learning how to live without them. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left their mark in the deep lines around his gray eyes and the way his hand instinctively moved to his hip where a sidearm used to rest. The truck's engine gave one final shudder before dying completely. Mike sat in the sudden silence, staring at his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel. 2 years ago, those same hands had held military commendations. Now, they shook slightly from medication he took for PTSD episodes that came without warning, triggered by everything from car backfires to children's laughter. He was supposed to be in Phoenix by evening for a construction job interview, his first real opportunity since leaving the VA hospital. The foreman had specifically mentioned they needed someone reliable, someone with discipline. Mike had served his country faithfully for 15 years, but civilian employers saw a different story. A homeless veteran living in his truck, taking pills for a broken mind. The diner's glass door reflected his approach, still tall at 6'2", but thinner than his military days. His faded army jacket hung loose on his frame, and his dark hair needed cutting. Inside, the air conditioning hit him like a blessing, carrying the familiar sense of coffee and fried food that reminded him of base mess halls in safer times. Helen Martinez looked up from behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. At 67, she'd been running Desert Rose for 15 years, ever since her husband died and left her with a business she'd never wanted but couldn't bear to sell. The lines around her brown eyes spoke of hard-earned wisdom and the kind of maternal instinct that never fully retired. "Coffee, hun?" she asked, already reaching for a cup. Something about military bearing was unmistakable, even in civilian clothes. Her own son had died in Iraq 7 years ago, and she'd learned to recognize the particular weight that combat veterans carried in their shoulders. Mike nodded, settling onto a cracked vinyl stool at the counter. From this position he could see the entire diner, old habits from staying alive in hostile territory. And that's when he first noticed the little girl at table 12 and the man who sat across from her like a stranger. Mike's coffee sat cooling in front of him as his trained eyes cataloged what his gut already knew was wrong. The little girl, maybe 6 years old, blonde pigtails tied with faded blue ribbons, hadn't moved from her rigid position in nearly 10 minutes. Children that age fidgeted constantly, chattering about everything and nothing. This one sat like a statue, her small hands the only part of her in motion as she continued tearing napkins into careful strips. The man across from her turned another page of his newspaper with deliberate precision. David Sullivan, though Mike didn't know his name yet, appeared to be in his mid-40s with the kind of generic appearance that made him forgettable. Medium height, brown hair going gray at the temples, wearing a rumpled business suit that suggested long hours of travel. What struck Mike wasn't what the man did, but what he didn't do. No interaction with the child, no attempt to order her food or drink. No concern when she'd been sitting motionless for so long. "That little one's been here near 2 hours," Helen murmured, following Mike's gaze as she refilled his cup. "Haven't seen her eat a bite. Man says she's his niece, but—" She let the sentence hang, the unspoken concern heavy between them. Mike's military training kicked into high gear, the same hypervigilance that had kept him alive in Kandahar now focused on a truck stop diner. He noted the exits: front door, kitchen entrance, likely back door through the restrooms. He assessed potential weapons, kitchen knives behind the counter, broken bottles, anything that could be improvised. Most importantly, he studied the body language between the girl and the man. No affection, no familiarity. The child's posture screamed fear to anyone trained to read such things. Emma Grace Thompson was tired in a way that went beyond needing sleep. 3 days ago, she'd been on the playground at Jefferson Elementary, teaching her best friend Sophia how to braid dandelions into crowns. She remembered the sound of her mother's voice that morning. "Be good at school, baby girl. Mama loves you to the moon and back." Those were the last normal words she'd heard. Now she sat across from the man who'd taken everything away: her home, her mother, her safety, and tried to remember what Grandma Betty had taught her before the cancer took her away. Smart girls don't just scream when they're in trouble, Emma Grace. Smart girls use their minds. They find ways to ask for help that the bad people don't notice. The napkin letters weren't working. The few truckers who'd passed her table either didn't look down or didn't understand what they were seeing. But this new man at the counter, something about him felt different. He had the same careful way of watching everything that her Uncle Tommy had before he went to the soldier place and came back different. Emma caught Mike's reflection in the window and made her decision. Slowly, deliberately, she began arranging sugar packets from the dispenser. 1 packet, 2 packets, 3 packets, pause. 1 packet, 2 packets, 3 packets, pause. The pattern her grandmother had taught her during thunderstorms when the power went out. SOS. Mike's blood went cold. The sugar packet pattern was unmistakable to anyone with military training. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The international distress signal. His coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down, his hands betraying the adrenaline spike coursing through his system. "Miss?" he called softly to Helen, who was wiping down tables nearby. "You might want to call the police." Helen's maternal instincts had been pinging like a smoke alarm since the odd pair had arrived. "You thinking what I'm thinking? I'm thinking that little girl is in serious trouble." David Sullivan's head lifted slightly from his newspaper. He hadn't heard the words, but some predatory sixth sense had detected the shift in attention. His pale eyes swept the diner, noting the veteran at the counter whose posture had changed from relaxed to ready. In his business, paranoia was a survival trait, and right now every instinct was telling him to move. "Time to go, sweetheart," he said quietly, the endearment sounding hollow and practiced. It was the first time Mike had heard him speak to the child. Emma's eyes went wide with panic. The soldier man had seen her signals, she was sure of it. But now Uncle David was standing up, reaching for her arm with fingers that squeezed too tight. "I need to use the bathroom first," she said quickly, the first word she'd spoken loud enough for others to hear. "You can wait until we get to the car. Please, Uncle David." "I really have to go." She made her voice small and desperate, the way that sometimes made him less angry. David hesitated. They were in public and a scene would draw unwanted attention. Fine. But make it quick, and leave the door open. Mike watched the interaction with growing certainty. The child's fear was palpable, and the man's controlling behavior confirmed every red flag his training had taught him to recognize. As Emma headed toward the restroom hallway, David following close enough to maintain visual contact, Mike made his own decision. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice low as he provided their location and a brief description of the situation. The dispatcher asked standard questions. Was anyone in immediate danger? Did he have proof of wrongdoing? Could he remain on the scene until officers arrived? "Ma'am," Mike said quietly, "I'm a combat veteran with 15 years of experience reading dangerous situations. That child is signaling for help, and if that man gets her out of here, you may never see her again." In the restroom, Emma stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her blue dress was wrinkled from sleeping in it, and her blonde hair had escaped its pigtails in wispy strands. She looked like what she was, a little girl who'd been away from her mother too long. But Grandma Betty had always said she was smart, and smart girls found ways to fight back. Emma took the small bar of soap from the dispenser and began writing on the mirror in shaky letters. "Help me. Emma Thompson. Call Mama." She could hear David's footsteps in the hallway outside, his impatience growing audible. "Emma. Time to go." She quickly smeared most of the writing away, but left one word visible: help. Maybe the next person would see it. Maybe someone would care enough to do something about it. When she emerged from the restroom, David's hand immediately clamped onto her shoulder with possessive force. "Say goodbye to this nice place, sweetheart. We have a long drive ahead of us." Mike stood up from the counter, his movement causing David to pause. For a moment, the two men sized each other up, predator and protector, civilian and veteran, evil and good. Emma looked between them with 6-year-old intuition that told her this moment would determine everything that happened next. "Excuse me," Mike said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Is everything all right here?" David's smile was practiced and cold. "Just a family trip, friend. Nothing that concerns you." "Funny thing," Mike replied, stepping closer. "The little lady's been sitting here for 2 hours sending distress signals, SOS and sugar packets, help messages in napkin pieces. That's pretty sophisticated for family playtime." The mask slipped from David's face for just an instant, revealing something calculating and dangerous underneath. Emma felt his grip tighten on her shoulder until it hurt, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she looked directly at Mike and mouthed a single, silent word: "Help." That was all the confirmation Mike needed. 15 years of military training crystallized into absolute certainty. This child was in mortal danger, and he was the only thing standing between her and whatever darkness waited beyond the diner's glass doors. The moment Mike Harrison recognized the sugar packet SOS signal, everything changed. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, not the crushing burden that had nearly destroyed him after Sarah's death, but the purposeful weight of a mission that mattered. His 15 years of military training crystallized into a single, unshakable certainty. This child was in mortal danger, and he was the only person in position to help her. "Helen," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations, "I need you to call the police right now. That little girl is being held against her will." Helen Martinez had been running the Desert Rose truck stop long enough to trust her instincts about people, and her instincts told her that this veteran knew what he was talking about. The maternal alarm bells that had been chiming softly since the odd pair arrived now rang at full volume. "You're certain?" "SOS signal with sugar packets. Military precision. That's not something a 6-year-old learns by accident. Mike's amber eyes never left table 12, where Emma continued her desperate signaling while David remained buried in his newspaper with deliberate indifference. She's been trained, which means someone prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. The implications sent a chill down Helen's spine. A child didn't learn distress signals unless adults in her life expected she might need them. What do I tell them? Tell them you have a suspected child abduction in progress. Male suspect, mid-40s, holding a female child approximately 6 years old. Suspect shows no normal parental interaction patterns. Child displaying signs of duress and attempting to signal for help. Mike's voice carried the clipped precision of someone providing intel under pressure. Tell them the witness is a former Marine with combat experience in threat assessment. Helen nodded and reached for the phone behind the counter, but before she could dial, David Sullivan's head lifted from his newspaper. Some predatory sixth sense had detected the shift in atmosphere, the way conversations had dropped to whispers and attention was focusing in his direction. His pale blue eyes swept the diner with calculating assessment, lingering on Mike's military bearing and Helen's position near the telephone. "Time to go, sweetheart," David said to Emma, his voice carrying false cheerfulness that couldn't mask the underlying threat. "Uncle David has some important business to attend to." Emma's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Her small body went rigid with terror, but her eyes sought Mike's with desperate hope. She mouthed a single, silent word: "Help." Mike stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening but positioned to block the most direct path to the exit. At 6'2", his presence was imposing even without the uniform, and years of combat had taught him how to project authority without escalating unnecessarily. "Excuse me," he said conversationally, addressing David while keeping his tone neutral. "I couldn't help but notice, is everything all right over here?" David's smile was practiced and cold, the expression of someone who had perfected the art of appearing normal while concealing monstrous intentions. "Everything's fine, friend. Just a family outing. Nothing that concerns you." "Funny thing about family outings," Mike replied, taking a half-step closer. "Usually involves some conversation between family members. Maybe ordering food, asking if the little one needs to use the restroom, basic parental interaction." His amber eyes locked onto David's pale blue ones. "But you two have been sitting there for 2 hours without saying a word to each other." The mask slipped slightly from David's face, revealing something calculating and dangerous underneath. "You've been watching us?" "I notice things. It's a habit from staying alive in hostile territory." Mike's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "And what I notice is a scared little girl who's been trying to ask for help while the man claiming to be her family ignores her completely." Emma seized the moment of adult confrontation to make her own desperate play. She slipped from her seat and darted toward the restroom hallway, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could manage. But David was faster, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist with bruising force. "Emma, get back here," he snapped, the facade of patient uncle evaporating completely. "We discussed this. No more bathroom breaks until we reach our destination." The casual cruelty in his tone, treating a child's basic needs as inconveniences to be managed, confirmed every suspicion Mike had harbored. This wasn't a father dealing with a difficult child. This was a predator controlling his victim. "Let go of her," Mike said, his voice dropping to the command tone that had once directed soldiers under enemy fire. "Right now." David's grip on Emma's wrist tightened instead of loosening, and she let out a small whimper of pain. "This is none of your business, soldier boy. Walk away." "Can't do that." Mike took another step forward, his military training automatically assessing angles, distances, and potential weapons. "See, that little girl has been asking for help for the past 2 hours. SOS signals, distress patterns, even writing on the bathroom mirror." And you've been pretending not to notice while you plan whatever comes next. The mention of the bathroom mirror made David's eyes flash with rage. He'd been counting on Emma's messages going unnoticed, relying on the general unwillingness of strangers to get involved in other people's business. But this former soldier was trained to recognize exactly the kind of signals Emma had been sending. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," David hissed, pulling Emma closer to his side with possessive force. "This child belongs to me. I have every legal right." "No, you don't." The voice came from behind the counter where Helen had been listening to every word while punching numbers into her phone. "Because I just called Detective Rodriguez, and he's running the license plate on that gray SUV in the parking lot, the one registered to Daniel Morrison, not David Sullivan." The use of his real name hit David like a physical blow. His carefully constructed identity was unraveling in real time, and with it, his control over the situation. The predator who had stalked Rebecca Thompson for months, who had groomed both mother and daughter for his trafficking operation, found himself exposed by a truck stop owner and a broken-down veteran. "You stupid old woman!" he snarled at Helen, abandoning all pretense of civility. "You have no idea what you've just cost me." Emma chose that moment to act with the courage that had kept her alive for 3 days. She stomped down hard on David's foot with her small sneaker, causing him to loosen his grip just enough for her to break free. But instead of running toward the exit, she ran straight to Mike, wrapping her small arms around his waist and burying her face against his faded army jacket. "Please don't let him take me," she whispered, her voice muffled but audible to everyone in the diner. "I want my mama. I want to go home." The simple, heartbreaking plea shattered any remaining doubt about the situation. This wasn't a family dispute or a misunderstanding. This was a child begging for rescue from someone who had stolen her away from everyone she loved. Mike's arms came down protectively around Emma's small shoulders, his body serving as a shield between her and David. "You're safe now," he told her quietly. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." David's face contorted with fury at this final defiance. His hand moved toward his jacket in a gesture that made Mike's combat instincts scream warnings. Armed, definitely armed, and desperate enough to use whatever weapon he was carrying. "Everyone needs to stay calm," Mike said loudly enough for the other customers to hear. "Helen, are those sirens I'm hearing?" They all listened, and sure enough, the distant wail of police sirens was growing steadily louder. Detective Rodriguez was responding faster than anyone had expected, bringing backup and possibly federal agents if Helen had mentioned the trafficking implications. David heard the sirens too, and the sound triggered a final, desperate calculation. He could try to shoot his way out, taking Emma as a human shield. He could attempt to blend in among the other customers and claim this was all a misunderstanding. Or he could cut his losses and run, abandoning his 2-year investment in the Thompson family, but preserving his freedom to victimize other children in other states. The decision was made for him when Emma looked up at Mike with 6-year-old wisdom that cut straight to the heart of everything that mattered. "Are you going to save me like soldiers save people?" she asked, her bright blue eyes reflecting absolute trust in his ability to protect her. Mike looked down at this brave little girl who had endured unimaginable trauma while never stopping her fight for freedom, and he saw Sarah's face in her features, not the resemblance of physical appearance, but the echo of innocence that deserved protection, childhood that should never be stolen, trust that adults had a responsibility to honor. "Yes," he said simply. "That's exactly what I'm going to do." The sirens were loud enough now to rattle the diner's windows, and through the glass they could see the flashing lights of multiple police vehicles converging on the Desert Rose truck stop. David Sullivan's trafficking operation, his months of grooming and manipulation, his carefully laid plans for disappearing with Emma into the underground network that bought and sold children like commodities. All of it was ending in a desert diner because one little girl had been brave enough to ask for help, and one broken veteran had been paying attention when she did. But David wasn't finished yet. Cornered predators were at their most dangerous, and he still had cards to play that would turn this rescue into something far more complicated and deadly than anyone could have anticipated. The police cars surrounded the Desert Rose truck stop like a carefully choreographed dance of law enforcement, their red and blue lights painting the late afternoon desert in alternating colors of urgency and hope. Detective Rodriguez emerged from the lead vehicle, his weathered face set with the grim determination of someone who'd seen too many cases like this one end badly. Behind him came Agent Sarah Williams of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, her auburn hair catching the desert wind as she surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. Inside the diner, the standoff had reached a critical point. David Sullivan stood near table 12, with his hand visibly moving toward his jacket, while Emma remained pressed against Mike's protective embrace. The other customers, an elderly trucker named Bill and a young mother with her toddler, had instinctively moved toward the far corner of the diner, sensing the danger without fully understanding its scope. "This is Detective Rodriguez with the Arizona State Police," came the amplified voice through a bullhorn. "We need everyone inside to remain calm while we assess the situation. No one is in trouble. We just want to make sure everyone is safe." Helen Martinez gripped the counter edge with white knuckles, her 68 years of life experience telling her that the careful politeness in the detective's voice masked something far more serious than a simple domestic dispute. She'd called about a suspected kidnapping, but the FBI's presence suggested they were dealing with something that crossed state lines, something that had been building for far longer than just today. David's pale blue eyes darted between the windows, calculating escape routes and assessing threats with the cold precision of someone who'd evaded law enforcement before. "This is all a misunderstanding," he called out, his voice carrying false calm. "Just a family situation that got blown out of proportion." Mike felt Emma's small frame tremble against him, and he could sense her terror at hearing David's lies spoken with such convincing authority. How many times had this monster used his ability to sound reasonable and trustworthy to manipulate systems designed to protect children? "Emma," Mike said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "I need you to remember something very important. You told me your mama's name is Rebecca Ann Thompson, and she works at Rosie's Diner in Tucson. That's the truth, right?" Emma nodded against his jacket, her blonde pigtails brushing his arm. "She makes the best pancakes in the whole world. She promised to pick me up from school at 3 o'clock, but then Uncle David—" Her voice trailed off as the enormity of her situation threatened to overwhelm her again. "It's okay," Mike assured her. "The police are going to check on your mama, and they're going to make sure you get back to her safely, but I need you to be brave for just a little bit longer." Agent Williams appeared at the diner's front door, her FBI credentials visible as she assessed the situation through the glass. Her hazel eyes immediately identified the key players, the child pressed against the veteran's protective stance, the man whose body language screamed guilty desperation, the elderly proprietor whose phone call had triggered this response. "Mr. Sullivan," she called through the door, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "I'm Agent Williams with the FBI. We'd like to speak with you about Emma Thompson." The use of Emma's real name hit David like a physical blow. They knew. Somehow, in the span of less than an hour, law enforcement had connected his current identity to Emma's disappearance. His carefully constructed cover story was crumbling, and with it, his chances of completing the transaction that would have netted him $50,000 from buyers waiting across the Mexican border. "I don't know anyone named Emma Thompson," David replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is my niece, Emma Morrison. I have custody papers in my vehicle." Agent Williams exchanged a look with Detective Rodriguez that spoke volumes about their experience with similar claims. Forged documents were standard operating procedure for trafficking operations, and David's insistence on paperwork in his vehicle suggested he'd come prepared for exactly this kind of challenge. "That's interesting," Agent Williams called back, "because we've been tracking Daniel Morrison's activities for the past 6 months. We know about the fake relationships, the grooming of single mothers, the systematic targeting of vulnerable families." Emma's head snapped up at the mention of her kidnapper's real name. "His name isn't Uncle David?" Mike felt his blood run cold as the implications became clear. This wasn't a random abduction or even a crime of opportunity. Emma had been specifically targeted, selected, groomed along with her mother as part of a sophisticated trafficking operation. Rebecca Thompson hadn't simply been unlucky in love, she'd been systematically manipulated by a predator who specialized in exploiting maternal vulnerability. "Emma, sweetheart," Mike said gently, "the man who took you has been lying about everything. His real name, his job, probably even how he met your mama. None of it was real." Helen Martinez felt her maternal heart breaking as she watched a 6-year-old child process the reality that her entire understanding of recent events had been built on lies. How did you explain to someone so young that adults could be monsters disguised as helpers, that kindness could be weaponized, that the man who'd bought her ice cream and helped with homework had been planning to sell her like property? David's control was slipping rapidly now, and everyone in the diner could see it. His pale blue eyes had taken on the wild look of a cornered animal, and his hand had moved definitively toward whatever weapon he carried. The false facade of reasonable businessman had been stripped away, revealing something desperate and dangerous underneath. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This operation is bigger than one truck stop, bigger than one little girl. There are people involved who will make sure none of you forget interfering with their business." Agent Williams stepped into the diner, her movement slow and deliberate to avoid triggering a violent response. Her hand rested casually on her holstered weapon, but her demeanor projected calm authority rather than aggression. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, we know exactly what we're dealing with. We've been building a case against your network for 2 years. Emma's rescue is just the beginning." The words hung in the air like a death sentence for David's operation. 2 years of federal investigation meant they had files, evidence, probably recordings and financial transactions that would expose the entire scope of his activities. The young mother pressed against Mike's side wasn't just one victim. She was the key that would unlock dozens of other cases. Emma looked up at Agent Williams with the sharp intelligence that had kept her alive through 3 days of captivity. "Are you here to take me home to my mama?" "That's exactly why we're here, sweetheart," Agent Williams replied, her professional composure softening at the edges. "Your mama has been looking for you every single day since you went missing. She never stopped believing she'd find you." The mention of her mother's unwavering search brought tears to Emma's eyes, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope mixed with guilt. "Is Mama in trouble because of the bad man?" Mike felt his heart clench at the question. Even in her own trauma, Emma was worried about her mother's well-being, displaying the kind of emotional maturity that no child should need to develop. "Your mama isn't in trouble," he assured her. "She was tricked, just like you were." But Agent Williams's expression suggested the situation was more complicated than simple comfort could address. The FBI's investigation had undoubtedly uncovered Rebecca's relationship with David, and there would be questions about how much she'd known, how complicit she might have been, whether she'd truly been a victim or something more ambiguous. David sensed the moment of maximum leverage approaching. The child's concern for her mother, the veteran's protective instincts, the law enforcement officer's need to resolve the situation without violence, all of it could be exploited if he played his cards correctly. His hand moved decisively toward his jacket, not to draw a weapon yet, but to remind everyone present that he retained the power to escalate this situation beyond anyone's control. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice taking on the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed through fear. "The little girl and I are going to walk out of here together. Any attempt to stop us, and I guarantee this ends badly for everyone involved." Emma's small hand clutched Mike's jacket tighter, her 6-year-old mind understanding that the nice policeman lady and the soldier man wanted to help her, but also recognizing the dangerous desperation in David's voice. She'd learned to read adult moods during her captivity, to anticipate when situations were about to turn violent. "I don't want to go with him anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I want to stay with the soldier man until my mama comes." Mike felt something break open in his chest at the child's declaration of trust. She was choosing him, specifically, as her protector. Not just any adult, not just the authorities, but him personally. The responsibility was enormous and terrifying, and exactly what he'd been searching for since Sarah's death. Agent Williams recognized the delicate psychology at play. Forcing Emma to go with law enforcement against her expressed wishes could traumatize her further, but allowing her to remain with an untrained civilian during an active hostage situation violated every protocol. The child's emotional needs and her physical safety were pulling in different directions. "Emma," Agent Williams said carefully, "Mr. Mike has done an incredible job keeping you safe, but now we need you to come with us so we can take you somewhere completely secure while we find your mama." "Can the soldier man come too?" Emma asked, her blue eyes moving between the FBI agent and Mike with desperate hope. "He promised to protect me." Mike looked down at this brave little girl who'd survived horrors that would break most adults, and he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I'll stay with you as long as you need me to," he promised. "We'll figure out the rest later." David's face contorted with rage at this display of solidarity between his victim and her rescuers. His entire operation depended on isolation, on making targets believe they had no allies, no options, no hope of rescue. But Emma had found protectors, and worse, she'd found the courage to choose them over her captor. The moment of decision had arrived. David's hand moved toward his weapon with deadly intent. Agent Williams' training kicked into high alert, Mike's body tensed to shield Emma from whatever was coming, and the little girl who'd started this confrontation with sugar packet SOS signals prepared to discover whether her faith in good people would be enough to save her life. The desert wind rattled the diner's windows like a countdown to violence, and everyone present understood that the next few seconds would determine whether Emma Grace Thompson went home to her mother or became another casualty in the war between predators and protectors. The desert sun hung low on the horizon, painting the truck stop parking lot in shades of amber and crimson as the final confrontation began to unfold. Mike Harrison stood between David Sullivan and the exit, his body language communicating what words could not. This child would not leave with this man. Emma pressed herself against the wall near the restroom hallway, her small frame trembling but her eyes alert, watching every movement with the hyper-vigilance of someone who'd learned that survival depended on reading the adults around her. "You're making a mistake, soldier boy," David said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This is my family business, and you're interfering with things you don't understand." His right hand moved subtly toward his jacket, a gesture that Mike's combat-trained eyes caught immediately. Armed, definitely armed, Helen Martinez had positioned herself behind the counter with her cordless phone, ready to dial 911 at the first sign of violence. At 67, she'd seen enough of life to recognize when a situation was about to explode, and every maternal instinct in her body was screaming that this little girl needed protection. The other customers, an elderly trucker named Bill and a young mother with a toddler, had gradually moved toward the far side of the diner, sensing the tension without fully understanding its source. "Emma," Mike said softly, never taking his eyes off David but speaking directly to the child. "Can you tell me your mama's name?" "Rebecca Ann Thompson," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible but clear. "She works at Rosie's Diner on 5th Street in Tucson. She has brown hair like mine used to be before." She touched her blonde pigtails with confusion, not understanding why her hair color had changed. David's face contorted with rage. The child had just provided specific details that could be verified, information that would unravel his carefully constructed cover story. "Emma, sweetheart, you're confused. You know your mama asked Uncle David to take care of you while she's in the hospital, remember?" But Emma shook her head with the stubborn certainty of a 6-year-old who knew the truth. "My mama's not in the hospital. She was making me pancakes when you took me from school. She promised to pick me up at 3 o'clock, and she never breaks promises. Never." The raw pain in the child's voice hit Mike like a physical blow. He'd heard that same note of abandonment in his own daughter Sarah's voice during their last phone call, when she'd asked why Daddy couldn't come to her birthday party, why the Army was more important than she was. The guilt he carried from that conversation, the last one they'd ever have, threatened to overwhelm him, but Emma's immediate need cut through his personal anguish like a knife. "Helen," Mike called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I need you to call Detective Rodriguez and tell him we have a kidnapped child here. Emma Thompson, age 6, taken from Tucson 3 days ago." David's hand moved decisively toward his jacket, but Mike was faster. 15 years of military training kicked in as he lunged forward, tackling David around the waist and driving him away from Emma's position. The two men crashed into a table, sending coffee cups and condiment bottles flying across the linoleum floor. "Emma, run to Helen!" Mike shouted as he grappled with David, trying to control the man's reaching hand before he could draw whatever weapon he was carrying. "Get behind the counter and stay down!" But Emma didn't run. Instead, she stood frozen in terror, watching the two men struggle violently just feet away from her. Her 6-year-old mind couldn't process the sudden explosion of adult violence, couldn't understand why the nice soldier man was fighting Uncle David, couldn't make sense of anything except the overwhelming need to disappear, to become invisible the way she had during the worst nights in the dark places David had kept her. Helen vaulted over the counter with surprising agility for her age, reaching Emma just as the child's knees buckled. "It's okay, baby girl," she whispered, wrapping her arms around the trembling child and pulling her to safety. "That soldier man is one of the good ones. He's going to keep you safe." David managed to break free from Mike's grip, stumbling backward and finally drawing a small pistol from his shoulder holster. The sight of the weapon caused the other customers to scramble for cover, the elderly trucker shouting warnings, while the young mother shielded her toddler and dove behind a booth. "Back off!" David screamed, his carefully maintained facade completely shattered now, revealing the desperate criminal underneath. "Back off or I'll kill her right here! I'll kill all of you!" Mike raised his hands slowly, his military experience teaching him to de-escalate when possible. "Easy now. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Just put the gun down and we can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about." David's voice cracked with strain and exhaustion. "You have no idea what you've just cost me. That little girl represents 2 years of work, 2 years of building trust with her mother, 2 years of planning. She's worth more than any of your lives." The casual way he spoke about Emma as property rather than a human being made Mike's blood run cold. This wasn't just kidnapping, this was human trafficking, and Emma was intended to be sold like livestock to the highest bidder. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer, followed immediately by the understanding that David would rather kill everyone in the diner than lose his valuable merchandise. "Worth more money, you mean?" Mike said carefully, trying to buy time while calculating distances and angles. But what happens when the FBI shows up? Because they're coming, David. Helen already made the call. David's eyes darted toward the windows, scanning the parking lot for signs of law enforcement. You're lying. There's no FBI. There's just a broken-down soldier and a nosy old woman who should have minded their own business. My name is Emma Grace Thompson, the child said suddenly, her voice cutting through the tension like a bell. She had stepped out from behind Helen's protective embrace, standing small but straight in the middle of the chaos. I am 6 years old. My birthday is March 15th. My mama's name is Rebecca Ann Thompson, and she loves me more than anything in the whole world. And you are not my uncle. The simple dignity in Emma's declaration stunned everyone in the room into momentary silence. Here was a child who had endured 3 days of terror and abuse, yet still possessed the courage to speak her truth in the face of a loaded gun. Mike felt something break open in his chest, a recognition of bravery that transcended age, that reminded him why he'd become a soldier in the first place. David swung the gun toward Emma with murderous intent, but Mike was already moving. Years of combat training compressed into a single moment of perfect clarity as he dove between the weapon and the child, his body serving as a human shield while his hand reached for David's gun arm. The pistol discharged with a deafening crack that seemed to echo forever in the confined space of the diner. Helen screamed Emma's name while the other customers dove for cover, but Emma remained standing, untouched and unharmed behind Mike's protective bulk. Mike and David struggled for control of the weapon, both men grunting with effort as they wrestled across overturned chairs and broken glass. Mike's superior training began to tell as he slowly forced David's gun hand away from Emma's direction. But the other man fought with the desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing steadily louder as multiple police units converged on the Desert Rose truck stop. David heard them too, and the realization that his escape route was closing triggered a final, desperate gambit. "If I can't have her, nobody can," he snarled, breaking free from Mike's grip and raising the pistol one final time toward Emma's small, defiant figure. But Emma Thompson, 6 years old and braver than anyone had a right to be, looked straight into the barrel of the gun and said the words that would haunt David Sullivan for the rest of his life. "My mama is coming for me. And she's going to be so proud that I was brave." The gunshot that followed Emma's brave declaration changed everything in the worst possible way. Mike's desperate lunge to shield the child had succeeded in deflecting David's aim, but not completely. The bullet meant for Emma's heart instead tore through Mike's shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the jukebox with a sickening thud. Blood immediately began spreading across his faded army jacket as he slumped to the floor, conscious but badly wounded. Emma's scream pierced the air, not the cry of a terrified child, but something deeper and more primal. For 3 days she had maintained her composure through unspeakable horrors, using her intelligence and courage to survive. But seeing the kind soldier man bleeding because of her, because he'd tried to protect her, shattered something fundamental inside her 6-year-old heart. "No, no, no!" she sobbed, dropping to her knees beside Mike's prone form. Her small hands fluttered over his wounded shoulder, wanting to help but not knowing how. I'm sorry. Please don't die because of me." Helen Martinez felt her own heart breaking as she watched the child's anguish. This was what evil looked like in the real world. Not movie villains with elaborate schemes, but broken men who destroyed innocence and turned children into casualties of their own darkness. She grabbed a clean dish towel from behind the counter and pressed it against Mike's wound, her 67-year-old hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. David Sullivan stood over them with the smoking pistol, his face a mask of rage and desperation. The sirens were getting closer, and he could see the flashing lights beginning to reflect off the diner's windows. His carefully planned operation was collapsing around him, 2 years of preparation destroyed by one nosy veteran and a child who refused to break. "This is all your fault," he snarled at Emma, his voice cracking with strain. "If you had just kept quiet, just been a good girl like I told you, none of this would have happened. That man is bleeding because you wouldn't stop fighting me." The psychological cruelty of blaming a 6-year-old for the violence of her abductor was devastating in its precision. Emma's sobs intensified as she looked between Mike's pale face and David's accusatory glare, her developing mind unable to process the complex reality that sometimes being brave meant people got hurt, and that wasn't her fault. Mike, despite the pain radiating from his shoulder and the concerning amount of blood he was losing, managed to focus on Emma's tear-streaked face. "Hey, little warrior," he whispered, his voice weak but determined. "Look at me, not him. This isn't your fault, you understand. You did everything right. You were braver than most soldiers I've known." But Emma couldn't hear his words over the roar of her own guilt and terror. In her child's logic, the nice man was hurt because she had asked for help. Maybe if she had just stayed quiet, just endured whatever David had planned for her, nobody would be bleeding on the diner floor. The psychological trauma was manifesting in real time as Emma began to shut down emotionally, retreating into the protective shell that children develop when reality becomes too overwhelming to process. Her crying stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie calm that was far more disturbing than her earlier terror. "I want to go with Uncle David now," she said quietly, her voice flat and emotionless. "I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me." Helen felt her blood run cold at the child's words. She'd seen this before in her own grandchildren after their parents' messy divorce. The moment when a child's spirit finally breaks, when they stop fighting and start accepting whatever adults impose on them. It was the death of innocence in real time, and it was happening right in front of her. "Baby girl, no," Helen said urgently, reaching for Emma's hand. "You don't understand. I understand perfectly," Emma interrupted, her 6-year-old voice carrying a terrible adult weariness. "Bad things happen to people who try to help me. I don't want any more people to get hurt." David Sullivan felt a twisted surge of triumph at the child's surrender. This was how he broke them all eventually. Show them the consequences of resistance, make them believe they were responsible for others' pain. Children were naturally protective of adults they cared about, and that instinct could be weaponized with devastating effectiveness. "That's right, sweetheart," he said, his tone becoming mockingly gentle again. "You see what happens when you try to run away? People get hurt. But if you come with me quietly, we can leave this nice man alone to get better." Mike tried to push himself up from the floor, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest. "Emma, don't listen to him. You're not responsible for what he does. You're just a little girl." "I'm not little!" Emma suddenly shouted, her emotional numbness cracking to reveal the rage underneath. "Little girls get protected. Little girls get saved. Little girls don't have to watch people bleed because they asked for help." Her voice broke on the last word, the weight of 3 days of trauma finally overwhelming her young psyche. The police sirens had reached the parking lot now, and through the diner's windows they could see multiple squad cars surrounding the building. A bullhorn crackled to life. "This is the Arizona State Police. The building is surrounded, and we need everyone inside to remain calm while we assess the situation." David's window of opportunity was closing rapidly, but Emma's psychological collapse had given him one last chance. If he could convince her to come willingly, to walk out with him as his human shield, he might still escape. His experience with broken children told him she was vulnerable right now, desperate to prevent more violence. "The police don't understand our situation, Emma," he said softly, holstering his weapon and extending his hand toward her. "They'll just cause more problems, hurt more people, but you and I can walk out of here peacefully. Nobody else has to get shot." Emma stared at his outstretched hand, then at Mike's blood-soaked shirt, then at Helen's terrified face. At 6 years old, she was being asked to make an impossible choice: go with the man who had stolen her childhood, or risk more violence befalling the people who had tried to save her. The weight of that decision was crushing her spirit in ways that even David's physical abuse hadn't managed. She began to reach for his hand, her movements mechanical and defeated, when Mike's voice stopped her. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible but filled with desperate urgency. "Sarah, Daddy's sorry. Daddy should have been there to protect you." Emma paused, confused. "My name isn't Sarah." Mike's eyes were unfocused, blood loss and trauma combining to send him into a delirious state where past and present blurred together. "I couldn't save you from the car accident, baby girl. But maybe I can save you from this. Maybe it's not too late to keep my promise." Helen realized what was happening. Mike was seeing his dead daughter in Emma, his guilt and protective instincts fusing in his wounded mind. But instead of being disturbed by his confusion, Emma seemed to recognize something familiar in his desperation to protect her. "You lost a little girl, too," she said softly, understanding flooding her young face. "That's why your eyes are so sad." Mike nodded weakly. "Her name was Sarah. She was 6, just like you. I was supposed to protect her, but I wasn't there when she needed me most." Emma looked between Mike's pale face and David's extended hand, and something shifted in her expression. The defeated acceptance was replaced by a spark of determination that reminded everyone present that this child had survived 3 days of horror through her own courage and intelligence. "I won't let him hurt any more daddies," she said quietly, stepping away from David's reach. "And I won't let him steal any more little girls." David's face contorted with rage at this final defiance. "You stupid little—" His words were cut off as the diner's front door exploded inward and tactical officers swarmed inside, their weapons trained on him with professional precision. But in the chaos of the arrest, with Emma's world finally collapsing around her and Mike's life ebbing away on the floor, the true tragedy was just beginning to unfold. The revelation that shattered everything Emma thought she knew came not from David Sullivan's confession, but from the FBI file that Detective Rodriguez opened 48 hours after the shooting. Agent Sarah Williams, a specialist in human trafficking cases, spread the documents across the hospital conference room table while Emma slept fitfully in the pediatric ward upstairs and Mike recovered from emergency surgery down the hall. "We've been tracking David Sullivan for 3 years," Agent Williams explained to the assembled group. Helen, Detective Rodriguez, and Rebecca Thompson, who had finally arrived after a harrowing cross-country drive. But the truth about Emma's situation is more complicated than anyone realized. Rebecca's face was drawn with exhaustion and fear. She hadn't slept since getting the call about her daughter's rescue, hadn't eaten since leaving Tucson in a borrowed car with a nearly empty gas tank. "What do you mean, complicated?" "That monster kidnapped my baby from her school playground." "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, he didn't." Agent Williams pulled out a photograph that made everyone in the room go still. It showed Rebecca and David together, clearly taken several months earlier, both smiling at a restaurant table. "David Sullivan has been in a relationship with you for the past 8 months. Emma wasn't randomly kidnapped. She was taken as leverage." The silence that followed was deafening. Helen's weathered hands gripped the edge of the table as she tried to process what she was hearing. Detective Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to click into place. But Rebecca's reaction was the most devastating, a slow crumbling of her composure as the implications became clear. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, that's not, I never. He said his name was Danny Morrison." "He was kind to Emma. He bought her books. He helped with her homework." Agent Williams continued with professional compassion. David Sullivan has used at least 15 different identities over the past decade. His method is always the same. Target single mothers with young children, build relationships over several months, gain trust, then use the children as assets in his trafficking operations. The truth was even worse than they'd initially understood. Emma hadn't been a random victim snatched from a playground. She'd been deliberately targeted, groomed along with her mother, selected specifically because David had identified her as valuable to his criminal network. Rebecca's guilt was transforming from the normal self-blame of any parent whose child had been hurt into something far more devastating. "He said he loved us," Rebecca said, her voice breaking. "He said he wanted to marry me, wanted to be Emma's stepfather. When Emma went missing from school, he was the one who comforted me, who helped me call the police, who held me while I cried. While he already had her hidden in a safe house 30 miles away," Agent Williams confirmed. "He was planning to comfort you through the investigation for several more days before suggesting you both leave town to start fresh somewhere with fewer painful memories. You and Emma would have disappeared completely." Helen felt sick to her stomach. "You mean he was planning to take Rebecca too?" "Not exactly. Rebecca would have served her purpose by providing him with a legitimate-looking family unit for border crossings and transportation. After that—" Agent Williams didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that Rebecca would have become another casualty in David's operation. But the revelations weren't finished. Agent Williams pulled out another file, this one marked with FBI classifications that indicated ongoing investigations. "There's something else. David Sullivan isn't his real name either. His actual identity is Daniel Morrison, and he has a daughter." Rebecca's head snapped up. "What?" "Her name was Katie Morrison. She was 6 years old when she died in David's care 18 months ago. Neglect, according to the medical examiner. She starved to death while he was running drugs across state lines." The pieces of David's psychological profile began assembling themselves into a horrifying picture. He wasn't just a trafficker motivated by profit. He was a broken man trying to replace his dead daughter with other people's children, using Emma as a surrogate for the child he'd failed to protect through his own criminal negligence. That's why he dyed Emma's hair blonde, Helen realized with growing horror. Katie Morrison was blonde. Agent Williams nodded grimly. Emma matched his daughter's physical profile almost exactly. Age, height, weight, even facial structure. "We believe he's been searching for a replacement since Katie's death, using his trafficking network to audition potential candidates." Rebecca was crying now, not the cleansing tears of relief, but the devastating sobs of a mother realizing how completely she'd been manipulated. "I brought him into our lives. I introduced him to Emma. I let him babysit her while I worked double shifts to pay for her school supplies. Oh God, I gave her to him myself." "Mrs. Thompson, you couldn't have known," Detective Rodriguez said gently. "These predators are sophisticated. They spend months, sometimes years, building false identities and relationships." But Rebecca wasn't listening to reassurances. The weight of maternal guilt was crushing her spirit as she realized that every kind gesture from Danny, every helpful offer, every moment of seeming love had been calculated, manipulation designed to gain access to her daughter. Meanwhile, 2 floors up in the pediatric ward, Emma was experiencing her own devastating revelation. The child psychologist, Dr. Amanda Foster, had been working carefully with her to process the trauma, but Emma's sharp 6-year-old mind was putting together pieces that the adults had hoped to keep hidden. "The man with the sad eyes," Emma said quietly, referring to Mike. "He thinks I'm his little girl who died." Dr. Foster nodded carefully. "Sometimes, when people are very hurt, they see things that remind them of people they loved who aren't here anymore. But I'm not Sarah." Emma continued with the logical precision that had helped her survive her ordeal. "I'm Emma Grace Thompson, and my mama is Rebecca Ann Thompson, and she works at Rosie's Diner. Except—" Her voice trailed off as confusion clouded her young features. "Except what, sweetheart?" "Except Uncle David knew where Mama worked. He knew her schedule. He knew which days I stayed after school and which days I went straight home." Emma's voice was becoming smaller, more frightened, as the implications of her own observations began to dawn on her. Dr. Foster felt her heart sinking. This was the conversation she'd been dreading. The moment when Emma would begin to understand that her kidnapping wasn't random, that the people she'd trusted had failed her in ways more complex than simple absence. "Emma, sometimes bad people spend a long time learning about families before they do bad things. That doesn't mean anyone in your family did anything wrong." But Emma was too intelligent to be satisfied with gentle deflections. "Mama knew him, didn't she? Uncle David wasn't really my uncle, but Mama knew him before he took me." The child's voice carried a note of betrayal that was heartbreaking to hear. At 6 years old, Emma was grappling with concepts that challenged adult understanding. The idea that love could be weaponized, that trust could be systematically exploited, that the people meant to protect children could inadvertently place them in harm's way. Down in the conference room, Agent Williams was delivering the final, most devastating piece of the puzzle. "There's one more thing you need to know about Emma's rescue. The man who saved her, Michael Harrison, he wasn't at that truck stop by accident." Helen looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "We've been tracking unusual activity along the trafficking routes for months. Someone has been feeding us anonymous tips about suspicious vehicles, license plates, behavioral patterns. Someone with military training and extensive knowledge of how these operations work." Rebecca wiped her eyes, trying to focus through her grief. "You think Mike was working with law enforcement?" "Not officially. But we believe he's been conducting his own informal surveillance of potential trafficking situations. The Desert Rose truck stop is located at a known checkpoint for these operations. Mike Harrison has been stopping there regularly for the past 6 months, always during peak trafficking hours." The implication was staggering. Mike hadn't simply stumbled across Emma's situation by chance. His PTSD, his guilt over his daughter's death, his need for redemption, all of it had driven him to become an unofficial guardian angel for other people's children, positioning himself where he could intercept situations like Emma's. "He's been hunting traffickers," Helen realized, "using himself as bait." Agent Williams nodded. "And yesterday it finally worked, but the cost?" She didn't need to finish. Everyone knew that Mike was still in critical condition, that his injuries had been life-threatening, that his desperate need to save Emma had nearly gotten him killed. Emma's rescue hadn't been a random act of heroism by a passing stranger. It had been the culmination of a broken veteran's 6-month campaign to prevent other children from suffering the fate his own daughter had endured. The truth was both more beautiful and more tragic than anyone had imagined, and it changed everything about how they understood what had happened in that desert diner. 3 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the Desert Rose truck stop, casting the same golden light that had witnessed tragedy and triumph in equal measure. Helen Martinez stood behind the counter preparing coffee for the early truckers, but her movements carried a different energy now. Purposeful, determined, touched with something that hadn't been there before the day Emma Grace Thompson had sat at table 12 asking for help. The diner looked much the same, but small changes told the story of transformation. A bulletin board near the entrance displayed photos and information about missing children. Red ribbons were tied to the door handles. Emma's idea, she'd explained, so other little girls would know this was a safe place. Most significantly, a small plaque hung beside the cash register, in memory of Sarah Harrison and Katie Morrison, and in honor of all the children who find their way home. Mike Harrison sat at his usual spot at the counter, his left arm still in a sling from the surgery that had saved his life. Physical therapy was progressing well, the doctor said, though the bullet had done permanent damage to his shoulder. He'd never regained full range of motion, but he was alive, and that was more than anyone had dared hope during those first critical hours after the shooting. "Morning, Helen," he said quietly, accepting the coffee she poured without being asked. Their routine had developed naturally over the weeks of his recovery. He'd arrive each morning around 7, sit in the same spot where he'd first seen Emma, and spend an hour or two just watching the road. "Any word from Phoenix?" Helen asked, though she already knew the answer. Rebecca and Emma had moved to Phoenix 6 weeks ago, starting fresh in a city where nobody knew their story, where Emma could attend a new school without the weight of being that kidnapped girl following her into every classroom. Mike shook his head, but his expression wasn't bitter. That's how it should be. They need space to heal as a family. What he didn't say, what Helen understood without words, was that the healing couldn't happen with him around. Emma had become too attached to her rescuer, seeing him as a replacement father figure in ways that complicated her relationship with her mother. Rebecca, meanwhile, was drowning in guilt over her role in David's access to Emma, and Mike's presence served as a constant reminder of her perceived failures. The child psychologist had explained it gently but firmly. Emma needed to rebuild trust with her mother, and Mike needed to process his own trauma without the complication of feeling responsible for another child's well-being. The separation was necessary, even though it left all three of them with a sense of unfinished business. "She's doing well, though," Helen said, pulling out a letter that had arrived 2 days earlier. Rebecca sent pictures. The photographs showed Emma in her new school uniform, gap-toothed smile bright and genuine. Her hair had grown out, the blonde dye fading to reveal her natural brown color. In one picture, she was holding a certificate for academic achievement. In another, she was surrounded by new friends at what looked like a birthday party. Mike studied the images with the careful attention he'd once reserved for intelligence reports. "She looks happy." "She is happy. And Rebecca's doing better, too. Got a job at a medical clinic, good benefits, steady hours. They're building a real life there." What Helen didn't mention was the other part of Rebecca's letter, the part where she'd written about Emma's nightmares, how the little girl still woke up screaming for the soldier man when the dreams got bad, how she'd ask every day when Mike was coming to visit, even though Rebecca had explained repeatedly that he lived far away now. The door chimed as a familiar figure entered the diner. Agent Sarah Williams had become a regular visitor since the case closed, partly for official follow-up, but mostly because she'd developed a personal investment in the people whose lives had intersected so dramatically that afternoon. "Morning, Helen, Mike." She settled onto the stool beside him, declining coffee but accepting a glass of orange juice. "I have news." Mike looked up with interest. Agent Williams' visits usually brought updates about the broader trafficking investigation that had grown out of David Sullivan's arrest. "We found them," she said simply. "All 12 children from David's network. The last 2 were recovered yesterday from a house in El Paso." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Mike's coffee cup trembled slightly in his good hand as the magnitude of those words sank in. 12 children, 12 families restored, 12 young lives given back their chance at normalcy. "Because of what happened here," Agent Williams continued, "because Emma was brave enough to signal for help, because you were trained enough to recognize it, because Helen was willing to get involved, 12 families get to have their children home for Christmas." Helen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, thinking about her own son who'd died in Iraq, about all the ways that saving one child could ripple outward into saving many. What about David? Sentenced yesterday. Life without parole. His testimony as part of a plea deal helped us identify the other locations. Agent Williams paused, then added, "He asked to send a letter to Emma. We denied the request." Mike nodded approvingly. The last thing Emma needed was contact from her abductor, no matter how remorseful he claimed to be. "There's something else," Agent Williams said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "The FBI has been authorized to create a new position, a civilian consultant specializing in trafficking recognition and intervention. Someone with military training and field experience. Someone who understands both the criminal psychology and the victim response." Mike looked at her steadily. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a purpose." The position would be based out of Phoenix, working with local law enforcement and community organizations to train people to recognize trafficking situations. Educational programs, awareness campaigns, intervention protocols. The implications were clear. Phoenix, where Rebecca and Emma were rebuilding their lives, a job that would use his skills for something meaningful. A chance to save other children without the complications of personal attachment. "I'd be working in the same city where they live," Mike said carefully. "In a city of 5 million people, yes. But Mike, this isn't about maintaining contact with Emma and Rebecca. This is about preventing what happened to Emma from happening to other children. You've already proven you can spot these situations when others miss them. Now we want to teach other people to do the same." Helen leaned across the counter. "It sounds perfect for you." Mike was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the desert highway where trucks continued their endless procession between somewhere and somewhere else. He thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made to protect her that he'd failed to keep. He thought about Emma's courage in that bathroom writing "help" on the mirror with soap. He thought about the 12 other children who were home now because one 6-year-old girl had refused to give up hope. "There's a condition," he said finally. Agent Williams raised an eyebrow. "What kind of condition?" "I want Helen involved. This place, the Desert Rose, it needs to be part of the network. An official safe haven with training for staff, protocols for handling situations like Emma's. Helen has the instincts for this work, and truck stops like this one are natural checkpoints for trafficking routes." Helen felt a surge of pride mixed with determination. At 67, she was being offered a chance to turn her business into something that could save lives. It felt like the most important work she'd ever been asked to do. "I accept," she said without hesitation. Agent Williams smiled. "I was hoping you'd both say that. There are already 12 other truck stops along this corridor that want to join the program. We're calling it the Red Ribbon Network in honor of Emma's suggestion about the door handles." The symbolism was perfect. Red ribbons marking safe places where children could ask for help, where trained adults would know how to respond, where the network of protection could catch other little girls before they disappeared into darkness. As if summoned by their conversation, the door chimed again, and a small family entered. Mother, father, and a little girl about Emma's age. The child was blonde, with bright blue eyes, and for just a moment Mike's breath caught in his throat. But this little girl was laughing, holding her parents' hands, clearly safe and loved and exactly where she belonged. The family settled into a booth, the little girl chattering excitedly about their road trip while her parents smiled indulgently. Normal family life, the kind Emma was building in Phoenix, the kind all children deserved. Mike pulled out his phone and composed a text message to a number he'd memorized but never used. "Tell Emma that the soldier man is proud of her. Tell her that because she was brave, lots of other little girls are safe now. Tell her that heroes come in all sizes, and she's the bravest one I've ever known." He showed the message to Helen and Agent Williams, then deleted it without sending. Some connections were too precious to risk disturbing with contact. Emma needed to build her new life without looking backward, and Mike needed to find his forward path without the weight of gratitude or obligation. Instead, he simply said, When do I start? Outside, the desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. But inside the Desert Rose truck stop, 3 adults were planning a network of safety that would stretch across hundreds of miles, touching thousands of lives, ensuring that no child's silent plea for help would go unnoticed again. The healing had begun. Message for American seniors, 200 words. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest miracles. Emma Grace Thompson was just 6 years old when she taught an entire community that paying attention to children in distress isn't just kindness, it's our sacred duty. Mike Harrison, a broken veteran carrying the weight of his own losses, found redemption not through forgetting his pain, but by transforming it into protection for others. Helen Martinez proved that it's never too late to turn your business, your life, your golden years into something that saves lives. Together, they created a network of safety that stretches across America, ensuring no child's silent cry for help goes unnoticed. This story reminds us that healing happens when we choose to see each other's pain and respond with action. Every truck stop, every diner, every place where families gather can become a sanctuary. Every grandparent, every community elder has the wisdom to spot what others miss. Your life experience, your protective instincts, your willingness to get involved, these aren't just valuable, they're essential. The children in your community need your watchful eyes and caring hearts now more than ever. Discussion questions. Have you ever noticed a child who seemed to be in distress? How did you respond? And what would you do differently now? What role do you think community elders should play in protecting children from predators in today's world? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your wisdom could help protect a child. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the playground at Mountain View Elementary School in Phoenix, Arizona. Emma Grace Thompson, now 7 years old and in 2nd grade, sat on the swing set during recess, her brown hair, grown out to its natural color, catching the light as she pumped her legs to soar higher into the desert sky. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, watched from nearby, noting how Emma had gradually transformed from the quiet, hypervigilant child who'd enrolled 6 months ago into someone who laughed easily and made friends naturally. Emma's made remarkable progress, Dr. Amanda Foster had told Rebecca during their last therapy session. Children are incredibly resilient when they have consistent love and support. The nightmares are becoming less frequent, and she's developing healthy coping mechanisms for anxiety. What Dr. Foster didn't mention was how Emma had become something of a protector herself among her classmates. When shy children sat alone at lunch, Emma invited them to her table. When someone seemed scared or upset, she had an uncanny ability to notice and offer comfort. The trauma that could have broken her spirit had instead refined her empathy into something extraordinary. Rebecca Thompson stood at the school's front office window, watching her daughter play with a mixture of pride and lingering worry that had become her constant companion. At 29, she looked older than her years. The stress of the past year had carved lines around her eyes and mouth, but there was also a strength there that hadn't existed before, born from surviving the unthinkable and choosing to rebuild rather than retreat. "She's doing beautifully," said Principal Johnson, joining Rebecca at the window. "Her reading scores are above grade level, and her teacher says she shows natural leadership qualities. You should be proud." Rebecca was proud, but pride was complicated by the persistent weight of maternal guilt. Despite months of therapy, despite the FBI's reassurances that she couldn't have known about David's true identity, despite Emma's own forgiveness freely given, Rebecca struggled daily with the knowledge that her choices had put her daughter in danger. "Sometimes I wonder if she'd be better off if I'd been more careful," Rebecca admitted quietly. If I'd been less trusting, less desperate for help with raising her alone. Principal Johnson, a grandmother herself, understood the self-recrimination that consumed parents after trauma. Mrs. Thompson, predators count on parents being loving and trusting. The fact that you opened your heart to someone you thought cared about your family isn't a character flaw. It's what makes you human. Across town, in a modest office building that housed the Southwest Regional Human Trafficking Task Force, Mike Harrison was reviewing case files for the Red Ribbon Network's quarterly report. The numbers told a story of remarkable success. 47 truck stops and diners now participated in the program. Staff at each location had received training in recognizing trafficking situations, and in the past year alone, 12 children had been recovered as a direct result of network interventions. Mike's role as civilian consultant had evolved beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. His combination of military training, personal experience with trauma, and intuitive understanding of predatory behavior made him uniquely qualified to develop protocols that actually worked in real-world situations. Law enforcement agencies across 3 states now consulted with him on trafficking cases, and his training seminars for business owners and community groups were consistently overbooked. "You've built something important here," Agent Sarah Williams said, settling into the chair across from his desk. She'd become not just a professional colleague but a trusted friend over the months of working together. The preliminary FBI statistics show a 30% increase in trafficking case identifications in areas where network locations operate. Mike nodded, satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that every success story represented a child who'd endured trauma before being rescued. "It's a start, but we need more locations, more training, more community awareness." "Speaking of community awareness," Agent Williams said, pulling out a folder marked with official FBI seals, "we've received a request that I think you should consider." Mike opened the folder to find a letter written in careful second-grade handwriting, complete with crayon illustrations around the margins. The return address made his breath catch. Mountain View Elementary School, Phoenix, Arizona. "Dear Mr. Mike," the letter began, "my name is Emma Grace Thompson. You saved me at the truck stop. I am in 2nd grade now, and I am very good at reading. My teacher says I can write a report about anyone I want for our hero project. I want to write about you. Can you please come to my school and tell my class about how to be safe? I think other kids should know about the signals and how to ask for help. Also, I want to say thank you in person. Love, Emma. P.S. My mama says it's okay if you want to come." Mike stared at the letter for a long moment, his emotions churning between joy at hearing from Emma and concern about disrupting her healing process. The child psychologist had been clear about maintaining distance to allow Emma to form healthy attachments with age-appropriate figures in her new life. "The request came through official channels," Agent Williams explained. "Emma's teacher contacted us after Emma proposed the project. Dr. Foster was consulted, and she believes Emma is ready for this kind of closure. In fact, she thinks it might be beneficial. A chance for Emma to reframe her experience in terms of empowerment rather than victimization." Mike read the letter again, noting the confidence in Emma's handwriting, the clarity of her request, the mature way she'd articulated her desire to help other children stay safe. This wasn't the traumatized 6-year-old he'd last seen in the hospital. This was a young girl who'd processed her experience and was ready to transform it into something positive. "There's more," Agent Williams continued. "The school wants to implement a safety awareness program for their students. Age-appropriate education about personal safety, recognizing dangerous situations, knowing who to ask for help." Emma's teacher thought having you speak to the students would be a powerful way to launch the program. Mike felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, not the crushing burden he'd carried after Sarah's death, but the purposeful weight of meaningful work. Emma wasn't asking him to be her father figure or protector anymore. She was asking him to be what he'd become. An advocate for children's safety. Someone who could teach others to recognize and respond to danger. "When?" he asked simply. "Next Friday. The school's holding a special assembly about community helpers and personal safety. You'd speak to Emma's class specifically, then address the larger group about the Red Ribbon Network and how businesses can help protect children." Mike pulled out his calendar, though he already knew he'd rearrange anything that conflicted. This wasn't just about closure for Emma. It was an opportunity to expand the network's reach into schools, to plant seeds of awareness in young minds that might save lives years later. "I'll be there." Agent Williams smiled. "I thought you might say that. Oh, and Mike, you should know that Helen Martinez is planning to drive down from the Desert Rose for the assembly. Apparently, Emma specifically requested that the nice lady who makes good coffee be there too." The thought of reuniting the three people whose lives had intersected so dramatically that day felt both right and significant. They'd each traveled different paths over the past year. Emma toward healing and normal childhood, Mike toward purposeful work, Helen toward community leadership. But they remained connected by the shared experience of choosing courage over convenience, action over apathy. That evening, Mike sat in his small apartment overlooking downtown Phoenix, drafting his remarks for the school assembly. He wanted to strike the right balance, serious enough to convey the importance of safety awareness, hopeful enough to inspire rather than frighten, personal enough to honor Emma's courage without exploiting her story. As he wrote, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief. "Thank you for saving my baby. Thank you for teaching her that there are good people in the world who will help when she asks. Thank you for showing her that being brave is worth it. Rebecca." Mike stared at the message for a long time before typing his response. "Thank you for raising a daughter who never stopped believing that help would come. Thank you for trusting me to be part of her story. She saved herself. I just happened to be there when she needed a witness to her courage." Friday morning dawned clear and bright with the kind of crystalline desert sky that made everything seem possible. Mike arrived at Mountain View Elementary an hour early, wanting time to acclimate to the school environment and review his presentation materials. The hallways were decorated with children's artwork and inspirational posters about kindness, courage, and community. Exactly the kind of positive environment Emma needed for her healing. Helen Martinez arrived shortly after, having driven through the night from Arizona's northern border. At 68, the long drive was more taxing than it used to be, but wild horses couldn't have kept her away from this reunion. She carried with her a box of red ribbons, enough for every student in the school, and a folder full of photographs showing the Desert Rose's transformation into a certified safe haven. "How do I look?" Mike asked as they stood outside the school's main entrance, suddenly nervous about seeing Emma again after so many months. Helen studied him with a grandmother's appraising eye. His physical recovery was complete, except for limited mobility in his left shoulder. The haunted expression that had marked his features for years after Sarah's death had been replaced by something calmer, more purposeful. He looked like a man who'd found his calling. "You look like someone a little girl can be proud to call her hero," Helen said simply. The reunion took place in Mrs. Rodriguez's second-grade classroom, with 22 seven-year-olds sitting cross-legged on the carpet in front of Mike's chair. Emma sat in the front row, wearing a bright yellow dress and a smile that could have powered the entire school. When she saw Mike enter the room, she didn't run to him or create a dramatic scene. Instead, she raised her hand politely and said, "Hi, Mr. Mike. Thank you for coming to our school." The maturity in her greeting took Mike's breath away. This was a child who'd learned to process intense emotions in healthy ways, who understood appropriate boundaries, who could acknowledge their connection without being overwhelmed by it. Dr. Foster's therapy had been remarkably effective. "Hi, Emma," Mike replied, settling into the child-sized chair that had been provided for him. "Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be here." For the next 30 minutes, Mike spoke to the children about safety in terms they could understand. He talked about trusting their instincts when something felt wrong, about the difference between secrets that keep people safe and secrets that make people feel bad, about how to identify trusted adults who could help in scary situations. Emma listened intently, occasionally raising her hand to ask thoughtful questions that demonstrated how much she'd learned from her own experience. She didn't share details about her kidnapping, but she did tell her classmates about the importance of staying calm when scared and looking for ways to communicate with people who might help. "Sometimes grown-ups don't notice when kids need help," she said during the discussion. "But if you're smart about how you ask, and if you don't give up, usually someone will see and help you." Her words carried the authority of lived experience, and her classmates listened with the respect children naturally show to peers who've survived something extraordinary. After the classroom presentation, the trio moved to the school's multi-purpose room for the larger assembly. Students from kindergarten through 5th grade filled the space, along with teachers, staff, and several parents who'd requested permission to attend. Mike's presentation to the larger group focused on the Red Ribbon Network and how community businesses could help protect children. He explained the training programs, the identification protocols, and the support systems that allowed ordinary citizens to become part of the safety net that kept children secure. Helen spoke about her experience as a business owner, describing how implementing safety protocols had transformed her truck stop from a place where criminals felt comfortable operating into a beacon of protection for vulnerable travelers. She distributed red ribbons to every person in the audience, explaining that they were symbols of commitment to watching out for each other's children. The assembly concluded with Emma stepping up to the microphone, her small frame barely tall enough to reach it even with the stand adjusted to its lowest setting. Her voice was clear and confident as she addressed the crowd. "My name is Emma Grace Thompson, and last year something very scary happened to me. But I want you to know that even when scary things happen, there are always good people who will help if you ask. Yeah, Mr. Mike and Miss Helen helped me when I needed it most, and now they're helping lots of other kids, too." She paused, looking directly at Mike and Helen with an expression of profound gratitude that brought tears to many adult eyes in the audience. "I learned that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Being brave means you do the right thing even when you are scared, and asking for help when you need it is one of the bravest things you can do." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Emma wasn't finished. "I want every kid here to know that you matter. You're important, and if someone ever makes you feel scared or unsafe, there are people like Mr. Mike and Miss Helen who will help you. You just have to be brave enough to ask." As the students filed out of the assembly, many stopped to shake Mike's hand or hug Helen, their young faces serious with understanding of the important lesson they'd received. Several teachers approached to request additional information about implementing safety protocols in their own classrooms. Principal Johnson pulled Mike aside as the crowd dispersed. "That was extraordinary. I've never seen children respond to a safety presentation with such engagement. Would you consider developing a curriculum we could implement district-wide?" Mike found himself agreeing before he'd fully processed the request. The idea of creating educational materials that could reach thousands of children felt like a natural evolution of the network's mission. As the official events concluded, Mike, Helen, and Emma found themselves alone in the now empty multi-purpose room. For a moment, the three of them simply stood together, acknowledging the invisible bonds that had been forged in trauma and strengthened through healing. "I have something for you," Emma said, reaching into her backpack to pull out a carefully wrapped package. I made it myself. Mike unwrapped the gift to reveal a drawing that took his breath away. It showed the Desert Rose truck stop rendered in crayon and colored pencil, with remarkable detail for a 7-year-old's artwork. In the foreground, 3 figures stood together: a tall man in an army jacket, an older woman with silver hair, and a small girl with brown pigtails. Above them, Emma had written in careful letters, "Heroes come in all sizes." "It's beautiful, Emma," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. I want you to hang it in your office," Emma said seriously. "So when you're helping other kids, you'll remember that what you do really matters." Helen wiped her eyes with a tissue, thinking about all the ways that saving one child had rippled outward to touch so many lives. Emma's rescue had led to the formation of the Red Ribbon Network, which had in turn led to the rescue of dozens of other children. Her courage had inspired a safety awareness program that would now reach thousands of students. Her recovery had given hope to other families dealing with trauma. "You know what I think?" Helen said, looking at both Mike and Emma with the wisdom of her 68 years. "I think sometimes God puts people exactly where they need to be, exactly when they need to be there. Mr. Mike was at the Desert Rose that day because Emma needed someone who would recognize her signals. Emma was brave enough to keep asking for help because she knew in her heart that good people would answer. And I was there because both of you needed someone who wasn't afraid to pick up the phone and call for backup." Emma nodded solemnly. "Grandma Betty used to say that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they just have kind eyes and brave hearts." As they prepared to part ways, Mike returning to his office, Helen beginning her drive back to the Desert Rose, Emma heading to her next class, there was a sense of completion that hadn't existed before. The circle that had begun with a desperate child's silent plea for help had closed with that same child confidently teaching others about courage and community. "Will I see you again?" Emma asked Mike as they walked toward the school's exit. Mike knelt down to meet her eyes, remembering a similar question from his daughter Sarah years earlier. This time he had a different answer. "You'll see me every time you help someone who needs it," he said. "You'll see me every time you use your voice to speak up for someone who can't speak for themselves. You'll see me every time you choose to be brave when it would be easier to look away." Emma hugged him then, a quick, fierce embrace that spoke of gratitude, closure, and hope for the future. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Mike. But mostly thank you for teaching me how to save myself." As Mike watched Emma walk back into her school, her yellow dress bright against the desert sunshine, he felt a peace that had eluded him since Sarah's death. His daughter was gone, and nothing would ever bring her back. But in saving Emma, in building the network, in dedicating his life to protecting other people's children, he had found a way to honor Sarah's memory that transformed grief into purpose. The healing was complete. The work would continue. And somewhere in America, another child who needed help would find it, because a 6-year-old girl had refused to stop believing that good people would answer when she called.